Over to Philip Mansell.
Thank you very much, Quentin. And we all have different Levants. For some it's geography or cities or families. But for some, the Levant is a set of activities and attitudes. Our previous conferences have focused on Smyrna, in 2014 on diplomacy in Istanbul. Our next conference, which Quentin will tell you more about, is in London, 2nd to the 4th of November 2016. And that will focus on trade and shipping. But one area which we haven't yet focused on is painting and the arts. And this is particularly important because for centuries before 1850, Europeans and Levantines were almost the only painters in the area of views and landscapes. And recently there's been a revival of interest in paintings of the Levant. You can now see over 50 pictures of Istanbul and its peoples in the Turkish cabinet in the Rijksmuseum, and they're all by Jean-Baptiste van Moor, who lived in Constantinople for 40 years from 1699. You can see the wonderful Lyotard exhibition now at the Royal Academy in London on until the 31st of January, one room of which is devoted to the magnificent pictures of Ottomans and Levantines done by Lyotard between 1738 and 1742. And there was recently an exhibition of pictures by Zonaro, who was painter of His Imperial Majesty's the Sultan Abdul Hamid in Florence. Please look at the catalogue afterwards if you'd like to. And perhaps we will form a specialist group one day on pictures of the Levant and have an exhibition, because many families, I'm sure, have views of Istanbul and Smyrna and Alexandria. They are vital because they alone give the area its visual record before photography. And another group of pictures which has now gone from a manor house in Sweden called Bibi to the Qatar Orientalist Museum in Doha is by a painter of appropriately mixed identity called Antoine van der Steen, who was there in the 1770s. And we're very lucky to have Brian Taylor to talk to us about him tonight. He's a retired geologist who spent 14 years in the Antarctic. He's not trained as an art historian, but that is really an advantage because, as you will see in the Royal Academy exhibition, there are many, many mistakes by the highly revered curators. They show two Levantine ladies having coffee and it's labelled a tea ceremony. Anyway, we're very lucky. First we have Brian Taylor in search of Antoine van der Steen, and subsequently we will have Valerie Neild talking about Snow in Smyrna, the travels of a portrait. She is herself an embodiment of the Levant, a daughter and a granddaughter and niece of consuls in Smyrna and Alexandria at a time when consuls were kings. Some of her ancestors of the Borel and Kern families lived in Smyrna, and she herself studied art history at the Court Hill. But first we will have Brian Taylor in search of Antoine van der Steen.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to address this foundation this evening. Perhaps I ought to begin by engaging you and asking you prior to this evening, has anybody here ever heard of Antoine van der Steen before? Be honest. Yes? One. Right. Well, for the rest of you, you're joining me because about 2 years ago I'd never heard of Antoine van der Steen. In fact, I don't think I even knew of his correct name. We're fairly sure now that that is what he's called, but other people have called him different names, so it's all been very, very confusing. But can I begin first of all by thanking Philip for his kind words of introduction. The topic I have before you this evening is a topic that I've been researching for many months, perhaps even several years. The life and the works of a little-known 18th century Dutch, but possibly Belgian painter, who initially defied identification. However, as you will hear later, while some progress has been made and some firm dates and established, the story of this Dutch painter remains unfinished business, which as yet is awaiting closure. Nevertheless, let me begin my story not at the beginning, because we don't know where he was born, when he was born, where he was born. We're not even absolutely sure of his identity. So I'm going to take a big step forward and begin my story in 1780. 1780 in Constantinople, where we first meet him, Sir Robert Ainslie, and George Baldwin. Several years ago, ladies and gentlemen, when I was reading the third edition of Colonel James Capper's account of his journey to India via Egypt in 1785, I came across, sandwiched between pages 96 and 158, a separate account of a journey undertaken in 1780 by George Baldwin from Constantinople to Aleppo. Now, the problem with this insertion is that the title had been subsumed into that used by Capper, which is why I think Van der Steen has not been discovered hitherto. Now, having carried out some research on Sir Robert Ainslie, the long-serving British ambassador at Constantinople, I'd heard of him. I'd also heard of my first character. Just a moment. Why doesn't this work?
Press enter.
Sorry?
Press enter.
Press. Can you just show me, please?
That's right. Is he right?
I was told to press one of these. Yeah, up. That's it. That's it.
Down on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Right. Right, we have him at last. This is George Baldwin, a consul in Cyprus, entrepreneur, and at various times a factor with the Levant Company and an agent of the East India Company. George Baldwin was a passionate believer in the need for England to develop much shorter trade and communication routes between India and Egypt via Suez, instead, of course, of the Euphrates-Tigris corridor. So Baldwin was trying to trace a quicker route to England. Ainslie, on the other hand, supported the Ottoman court. So the two people were bitterly opposed to one another. And when Baldwin set off for India in May 1780, Ainslie referred to him as, and I quote somewhat sardonically, the famous Mr. Baldwin. Now, Baldwin's 61-page account of the first part of the intended journey from Constantinople to Aleppo describes a 70-day trip on horseback across central Anatolia, a terrain only visited before by a few of the more intrepid European adventurers, just as Paul Lucar, for example, whose report on the wonders of Cappadocia were written in such an outrageous form that they were initially disbelieved by his contemporaries. Now, Baldwin's party included a gentleman called Mr. ... a painter by profession, or alternatively, my friend the painter. And towards the end of the 17-day journey across Anatolia, survived an attack by robbers. Baldwin, although shot in the arm, also survived. But unlike the painter, Baldwin abandons his attempt to reach India, and he returns to Constantinople and to his wife, Jane Maltas. Now, the landscape painter, currently without a name, presumably hired to make a series of sketches of the journey, could not possibly have overlooked, I suggest, some of the many rock-cut monuments, tombs, altars, and inscriptions noted by others in the central parts of Anatolia, where, of course, relatively soft volcanic rocks have been denuded by nature and the activities of man. However, unless the artist's other sketches were lost when Baldwin's party was attacked and the contents of a portmanteau dispersed, he only produced one drawing. And this was subsequently inserted between pages 108 and 109 of Baldwin's text, but only in the third edition. Escorted to a site in the Phrygian highlands bounded by the modern cities of Ephron and Eskehir, Baldwin and the artist came across what their guide and local aga referred to as a most wondrous building, on which, reports Baldwin, frank characters were inscribed, and which must have been erected before the Turks had driven the infidels, the Gayours, from the country, unquote. Now, unbeknown to them, Baldwin and the artist were probably the first Europeans who discovered what is now referred to as the Midas Monument, the 17-18 meter high inscribed facade that looked like the frontage of a temple or a house, and that seems, said Baldwin, and I quote, to have been the work antecedent to the classical institutions in architecture, but, he emphasized, regular, sublime, and bold, with overall polygonal ornamentation and pigmented roof, crowned by an acroterion comprising two inwardly curving volutes. Now, Baldwin was astute enough to resist any attempt at interpreting the significance of the site and its inscriptions, tasks that in fact he left to others, like, for example, Brigadier General Kerner and party, including the geographer William Martin Leake, therefore gifting this discovery to others. So, ladies and gentlemen, who was the professional painter and friend of George Baldwin? Who produced the unsigned and undated drawing of the Midas Monument? Well, two sources provide an answer. In 1968, in an unpublished doctoral thesis on George Baldwin and Egypt, submitted to SOAS by Rosemary Said Zalan, she refers, and I quote, to a Van der Steen, a Dutch painter, who planned to accompany Baldwin on a journey from Constantinople to Aleppo, Basra, and India. Dr. Zalan's information was derived from a Foreign Office document, FO/71, that includes an item of correspondence between Sir Robert Ainslie and the Earl of Hillsborough, in which Ainslie refers to, and I quote, the famous Mr. Baldwin, having departed his place in the most secret manner on the 11th inst, i.e. from Constantinople, accompanied by a Dutch painter named Van der Steen, who he debauched out of my family. Ainslie continues, I am informed that they took the road of Aleppo with intention to proceed to Basora and embark for India. A literature search from the mid to late 18th century for a Dutch artist named Van der Steen revealed a Jan van der Steen, an obscure painter of whom nothing was known about his date and place of birth, or indeed whether he was trained by one or more of the guilds. The earliest account in 1789 about Van der Steen was by a traveller, writer, and physician, Peter van Versel, who reported that Herr van der Steen, and I quote, had travelled overland from Turkey to Oostindie in the company of several Englishmen, changed his name to Mr. Stone, became a lieutenant of artillery in the service of the East India Company, and died in Bengal. Now, in compiling this account, Van Versel may have received some help from Baron de Heften, the Dutch ambassador, and in fact a correspondent of Van der Steen, as well as the diplomat Just Frederick Thor, who was based at the Dutch embassy in Constantinople between 1765 and 1778. And those dates will become significant in a moment. Subsequently, other writers have suggested that the artist was active between circa 1750 and 1780, that he worked in and around Constantinople in the 1750s, and then travelled overland to India between 1750 and 1760. I'm sorry, you ought really have to have a sheet of paper with these dates in front of you because it gets quite complex, but if you can hold some of them in your heads, all fine. Now, in 1994, further information was provided by my distinguished friend on my right, Philip Mansell, following a visit he made to an estate at Bibby, near Stockholm, Sweden, belonging to the von Celsing family. Now, the family had been linked diplomatically with the Ottoman court via Gustav Celsing Sr. since the first and second decades of the 18th century. At Bibby, amongst a substantial collection of Ottoman art, Mansell reported seeing, and I quote him, 25 hypnotizing but unsigned panoramas of the Golden Horn, the city, the palaces and boats, the views of the Bosphorus, and above all, he writes very eloquently, the blue and green kiosks gilded pavilions of the Saladabad, of which they are the best, he quotes, visual record, unquote. Now, these paintings, suggested Philip, may have been made by the same artist, an A. van der Steen, who signed one of several associated watercolour drawings, which A. van der Steen dedicated to Monsieur Gustav de Celsing, resident and envoy of the Swedish embassy in Constantinople between 1747 and 1780. The dedication also suggested that these paintings and drawings were executed prior to 1770, i.e. prior to Ulrich Celsing succeeding his brother, although, to complicate matters slightly, Gustav Celsing Jr. remained in Constantinople until 1773. Now, from the above, if you're still with me, I hope you are, it occurred to Philip and myself that Jan van der Steen, of previous authors, the van der Steen of Ainsley, and the A. Steen associated with the Celsing collection of Oriental art were probably one and the same person. A conjecture subsequently substantiated in 2011 when Andrew Fletcher, a senior director of Sotheby's, examined the landscape paintings in the von Celsing collection. Beneath one of the oils, representing a view of the Bosphorus, Andrew Fletcher discovered a signature and date, Steen, 1771. Furthermore, Fletcher concluded that another painting in the collection, representing, for example, the Sultan's Palace of Beşiktaş, must have been painted prior to 1780 because the artist omitted to depict the Queen Mother's apartment, which was not built until 1780. All the paintings in the Celsing collection by van der Steen or attributed to him represent views of Constantinople, including two from the grounds of the Swedish embassy, and suggest that the artist was a resident in Constantinople all this time, perhaps living in the embassy itself. Also discovered at Bibby in 2011 was a travel chest. a travel chest belonging to the Swedish diplomat Ulrich Celsing that had remained unopened since the end of the 18th century. In it, Fletcher found a number of letters written in French by or referring to Van der Steen, notably one dated the 30th of September 1768, in which the artist updates Son Excellence, who was away on a diplomatic mission, on his progress in finishing off 2 views. Van der Steen also complains about the bad weather that prevented him going out into the countryside to draw. Clearly this letter and the signed and dated painting referred to earlier indicate that the artist was residing in Constantinople between at least 1768 and 1771, and probably for several years either side of these 2 dates. Thus we know that the landscape artist Van der Steen did indeed work in and around Constantinople between 1768 and 1771, and not, I emphasize, 1750 to 1760. But is there any truth in the suggestion voiced previously that following his sojourn there, he travelled overland to India, became an artillery officer, and died in India before 1784? The correspondence between Sir Robert Ainslie and the Earl of Hillsborough, cited earlier, refers to the fact that when Van der Steen and Baldwin left Constantinople for India on the 11th of May 1780, Baldwin had debauched the artist from the ambassador's family. The word to use, debauched, suggesting that sometime between 1771 and 1780, Van der Steen was not only under the patronage of the Celsings, he was also under the patronage of Sir Robert Ainslie. Yet more information on Van der Steen was discovered by Evelyn St. Nicholas of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, when she came across 2 letters in the National Archives in The Hague in 2012. Written in French by Antoine van der Steen from Aleppo in Syria, and addressed to Baron de Heften, the Dutch ambassador in Constantinople. They, dated the 13th of June and the 22nd of August 1780, allude to discomforts complained about in Constantinople, of the need to keep the journey with Baldwin a secret, and Van der Steen's determination to continue on to India alone following the attack on Baldwin's party. From these letters, it is also possible to deduce from references to going through the desert and ostrich feathers for Madame de Heften that Van der Steen intended to travel via the Euphrates-Tigris corridor to Basra before boarding a ship for Surat, as he carried with him letters of recommendation written on his behalf by Nicholas Nomastic to the Consul de Pegal, to the governor there. Because the route between Aleppo and Basra was often used by employees of the East India Company, it is possible, but as has been referred to by previous writers, that Van der Steen was accompanied on this part of the journey by several company employees. Finally, did Antoine van der Steen join the East India Company? Did he become an artillery officer? And did he die in India before 1784? Well, yes, he did, but not in Bengal. In fact, following his arrival in Surat in 1780, Van der Steen joined the Bombay Artillery, along presumably with several other foreign nationals. And by the 19th of June 1781, he attained the rank of Lieutenant Fireworker. And then we know from the records kept by the Bombay Artillery that he died, cause not officially recorded, on the 31st of October 1782. Now, in addition to his military duties, Van der Steen painted at least 5 watercolours representing the Bombay-Surat area, in which the Western Ghats form a backdrop to a series of tranquil scenes, seemingly far removed from any warlike activity. although faults occur in all the paintings. These paintings, I suggest, although I've been accused of being slightly over the top in this matter, represent some of the earliest views of north and western India by European artists in the 18th century. Recent research and discoveries and the identification of paintings hitherto referred to as anonymous as the works of van der Steen have, I suggest, helped in reassessing and re-evaluating the life and work of this Dutch artist. However, when I conclude, several questions remain unanswered. Perhaps you can help me this evening. For example, his date and his place of birth. His whereabouts prior to 1768 and his appointment to the Bombay Artillery. Could his skills as a draftsman have been sufficient to make him acceptable to an artillery regiment, or did he acquire a knowledge of weaponry while in some other occupation? For example, in the decade when van der Steen was, according to some previous research workers, travelling between Constantinople and India, i.e. between 1750 and 1760, could he have been employed elsewhere? Could he have been employed as a sheep's corporal, where his responsibilities would have included maintaining the ship's weaponry, as well as assisting the master of arms in his duties? Now, one such sheep's corporal was named, you've got it, Anthony van der Steen. Anthony van der Steen from Bruges. Anthony van der Steen from Bruges made 2 voyages as a sheep's corporal between 1751 and 1761, after which he was, to quote, repatriated. Therefore, could the sheep's corporal from Bruges and the artist Anthony van der Steen be one and the same person? It's an intriguing possibility. Thank you.
Excellent research.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, for that wonderful talk. It just shows how much waits to be discovered in family chests. And now